You know, never let trauma dictate who you are or how you handle things, because you never know when you might be in a position of power to help a lot of people, and your trauma is still dictating who you are and what you do. What's good, y'all? Hope everybody's well. Appreciate those of you who waited for me to get through this hiatus. Took a little break for a little while. So for those of you that are still listening and supporting the Onyx Report, I appreciate it. Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel. I am trying to get to 30,000 subs, so I'm fairly close. So I hope you'll help me do that. And, support the channel so we can continue to bring you independent black male thought about issues, because we don't have a lot of venues, a lot of places that allow us to do that. So that said, appreciate you being here. We're going to talk a little bit today about Tyler Perry. I ran across this on my Facebook page. Some of the brothers were kind enough to share some different things that, he said. I thought I wanted to reflect a little bit on a couple of them. So let's listen to the first one. Right. So here we go.
I grew up in the house with, my father was a motherfucker, man. And my mother loved him with all her might and strength. So here I am, a kid that he hated because I was creative. I would write and draw. He's like, nigga, this shit ain't never gonna make, fuck you think you, get your, hitting me upside the head and all this other stuff, right? But her love and her passion, not just for me, but for him, blew my mind. I'm like, how can you love this horrible person, right?
You and Dad are not close, Hasan?
No, not at all. I haven't talked to him in probably 11 years.
Okay.
But he gets a check every month, brand new house,
Still take
brand
care
new car. Absolutely, because my mother asked me to. So I gave him what he gave me. We were never hungry. There was always food in the house, and the lights were always on.
Okay.
So I make sure he had that, right?
Okay.
But he's missing the best part, which is the relationship with me. But just being at her apron, watching her struggle and go through this stuff, I had a very open heart to just not only her, but just women, black women. I don't know how you can sit in the lap of a black woman and watch her go through that kind of hell and it not affect you. Mm-hmm. So all of my first movies were about my mother subconsciously saying, like, Diary of a Mad Black Woman.
Right. So basically, you can see the origins of Perry's, gynocentrism, the focus on black women, the focus of prioritizing their stories, their perspectives, their outlook, and in a way, the demonization of black men. And there's a color dynamic to his early films too. You could see where dark-skinned men were the problem, so on and so forth. That dynamic existed with him as well. But the focus of prioritizing black women's perspectives is very much personal. And this is why I talked about not letting trauma define you. Because if you do, you lose perspective, and you often will overlook some of the things that really are important to deal with, right? Important to deal with. And if you're in a position to help a lot of people, whether they be black boys or other men or the community itself, you're not in a position to see these things. Now, ironically enough, operating in, black male studies, operating in the black manosphere, I've heard these critiques brought to other brothers I know, the space in general, or the spaces in general, and me directly. The assumption being that we're led by trauma. Now, that is absolutely far from the truth, especially in my regard. I've done my work. I know what that is. I've had therapy. I've gone through all of that. The work I'm doing is about actually trying to help uplift black men and boys by first helping us identify what the issues are that we grapple with most and giving us a vocabulary to do it. I'm not driven by rage at women or the system. No, I have my perspectives and critiques about those things, but my priority is about helping uplift, using critical analysis, using data, using relevant information, and developing a vocabulary. So I just want to be clear. But these are the kind of things that happen when you don't manage that trauma. So what you just heard from Tyler Perry helps us, gives us a kind of view on some of his motivations. But let's listen to another one. And in this one, he's doing an interview with Oprah and talking about his earliest sexual experiences.
Child, when was the first time you were molested as a child?
I was probably about 5 or 6 that I remember. And
5 or 6.
I'm building a birdhouse, and, you know, he had his hand in my pants.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, what is this? And I felt my body betraying me because I felt, it's odd because I felt an erection at that age.
At that age.
And I left myself again. You know, so all of this is going on in the house, and this is going on outside.
So there's no safe haven for you, really.
There was no safe haven, and that's all I remember about him. And the next person I remember was a nurse in the hospital. I had been rushed to the emergency room from school for something, and a male nurse comes in, and he was doing the same thing that this man was doing. And again, I left myself. And then there was the man in the church who, you know, used God and the Bible against me, you know, to justify a lot of the things that were going on. It was so horrible. And that was the first time, my first sexual experience was with this man performing oral sex on me as a boy.
The man in the church.
In the church. And the woman who, I went over to play with her son, and she lived a couple of doors down from me. And I go over to play with her son, and she and her boyfriend are sitting there. And she was dressed weird. I didn't know what that was at the time. And I'm in the room playing with her son on the floor with the Matchbox cars, and I hear arguing from the living room. She comes in, she throws him in the bathroom and says, we were in the bedroom. She throws him in the bathroom and says, he take a bath and go to bed. And she tells me to go home, and I go to the door to try and unlock the door, and I'm hearing the click, click, click of the door, and I couldn't unlock it. And she lays on the sofa and she spreads her legs. I didn't know she was wearing lingerie at the time. I said, I have to go home, it's getting dark.
You're 10.
I'm 10. And she says, you want to go home? She lights a cigarette. She takes the key. She said, here's the key. And I come over to get it, and she puts it inside of herself. And she tells me to get it.
Like inside her vagina?
Yeah. So I get the key, but I feel my body betraying me again because I felt an erection. It's so disgusting, you know, what these people did to this little boy. And she pulled me on top of her, and I was inside of her. So my first sexual experience was with a woman. That was it. Yeah.
You know, people like to be real flippant with these kind of experiences, and I've heard this all my life. I've heard it from women, I've heard it from men, I've heard it from law enforcement, from public officials, where they'll talk about the violation of a boy under this kind of idea that, you know, it's pretty consistent and rampant about men and boys in general, that we just need a wet hole. We love sex no matter where it comes from, and, you know, you should like it. And you hear these kind of things, even when it comes to a 5-year-old boy. And if you've not heard it from anyone else, I will tell you that is absolute bullshit. This is the kind of thing that traumatizes children, female or male. The problem is we don't have much empathy, social empathy for males. We don't even have a narrative for what violation and molestation looks like for boys, not one we take seriously. So often it's not talked about, it's ignored. And we're kind of hyper vigilant when it comes to girls and women, when it comes to, you know, this idea of at least seeing it as a problem. If you run across somebody that has violated a girl, there's a shared public sentiment that that person needs to be punished, whether it's incarceration or death. Not saying it's always a rational response. It is what it is. But when it comes to boys, we have a cognitive dissonance about the matter, and we just kind of don't know how to process it, and we just kick it out of our minds. And so what happened to Perry was absolutely traumatizing and ridiculous, and it should have never happened, let alone to the hundreds of thousands of Black boys that may have experienced this from over generations. And how much more rampant is it if it's not really even a subject that we discuss, right? For the most part, the sexual violation of boys by other men is not discussed. The sexual violation of boys by women is considered a public good in the Black community. It's considered a rite of passage. The perspective is, even from women, this woman helped you become a man, or she gave you a gift. Absolute bullshit. This is traumatizing. Even for teenagers, when you're dealing with older women, most particularly over 30, 40 years old, you'll find story after story across race of young teenagers who could not emotionally handle what came along with the sex. It's not about the sex by itself. It's about what came with it. And a lot of these boys experience trauma and go off the rails because they can't handle these women, these mature older women. Okay? So even though we think that this stuff should be whatever, it's just a sexual act, it doesn't matter, absolutely not true. And I am also saying this as somebody that experienced it myself. First time I experienced it, I was probably about 3.5, 4 years old. And it was a babysitter. But it wasn't really a traditional babysitting situation. My mother and father, I think, went out and they left me with the downstairs neighbor. She was an older white woman, and it was her son, her teenage son. I was about 3.5, 4. I didn't even remember it fully until I was 21. And I was sitting in a women's studies class listening to them talk about rape. And they talked about it as if they owned it, as if this was something that men and boys never experienced. And they did a lot of the finger wagging to let us know how seriously we need to take this and how much we need to defend women and girls. It struck me in the middle of class like I was watching a television show in my head. It was clear as day. There was every part in me that remembered this as an experience, not a fantasy, not something that just arbitrarily popped in my head. It was a hardcore memory. But I think what happened is I didn't know how to process it at that age, so I just put it on a shelf. And when I'm sitting in this class, it came back clear as day. And I realized in that class at that moment, there's no language for what happens to boys. I didn't have a language at 4 or 3.5, and I damn sure didn't have a language at 21. So I had to be lectured to by this class full of women telling me how seriously I need to take rape. But there wasn't even a language for me. And as I started to talk about this over the years, I can't tell you how many Black male students would walk up to me and share their stories, but they didn't know how to until I shared mine. Now, the second time I was molested, I was just under 10, and it was from an older girl, and she was a babysitter as well, and she did things that I just really wasn't ready for. I didn't necessarily initiate. I didn't know anything about it. It just happened. But my point is simply that we have to protect our boys. And the first stage in that protection, as far as I'm concerned, is giving us a language to talk about it and being willing to do so. So I salute Tyler Perry doing that in this episode. However, what I'm also adding to this discussion is the importance of us doing this kind of work while having grappled with the difficulties of navigating and really growing past that trauma. I think Perry has been dealing with that in the course of his artwork, but the way he's dealing with it, I think, can also cause more problems, because many of his films are about, prioritizing women and girls and really downplaying the struggle of boys and men in very patronizing ways at times. And that in and of itself produces problems. I'm going to share with you an article that came out. Let me see. This is on essence.com. Trying to see if it has the date on it. Yes, October 27th, 2020. And he deals with it here, right? So this article is entitled, Tyler Perry, My Mother Lied About My Biological Father. Says, I love my mother to death, but she lied to me, says Perry. Now, many of you are probably more aware about this stuff than I am. I don't always follow pop culture, but I think there's some important things to talk about from time to time. And this is a short piece, so I'll just go through it real quick. Tyler Perry is opening up about a family secret. He revealed that the man who raised him, Emmett Perry Sr., is not his biological father. He says, I love my mother to death, but she lied to me, he told Radio 1 founder Kathy Hughes during an interview at Women's Empowerment 2014. Perry added that he always suspected that Perry Sr. wasn't his real father because of the abuse that he inflicted on him. Perry's mother, who is now deceased, always insisted that the man he refers to as a bastard was his biological father. According to News One, Perry cautioned parents about the importance of telling children the truth. Completely agree with that, by the way. This is not the first time he has come forward with details of his turbulent childhood. In a 2010 interview with Oprah, he opened up about the details of the abuse from his father and other adults in his life. After his mother's death, Tyler took a DNA test with his brother, which revealed that they did not have the same father. He then took a test with Perry Sr., confirming that he already suspected. Perry says the search for his real father continues. Now, I bring this up to say, in allowing our unresolved trauma to dictate what we do, I think in this instance, what we see from Tyler Perry is an agenda that prioritizes women and girls, even though he's been victimized by women. You know, we just listened to the story he told about being sexually molested by a grown woman at 10 years old. That doesn't really enter his work in the same way his analysis of black men as negative monsters, in a sense, has taken center stage. We don't see that kind of balance, even though he's experienced it in his life, right? But then we get to one of the most egregious parts of his life. And I say egregious because even though it doesn't have to do with necessarily, you know, a physical abuse kind of dynamic or a sexual one in this instance, it's coming from his mother. And this is the woman that he is fairly, you know, he's pedestalized to some degree. We've heard that in the first clip I played, how much he, you know, really, you know, saw her in a very particular light. And then had to grapple with, after her death, the reality that this woman had lied to him about who his father was. And in a way, if you allow it to process, may have explained some of his stepfather, we'll just use that term, stepfather's, you know, antipathy toward him. That might have played a role in some of this. Right? It may very well have been that the father that was in the house, as abusive and problematic and dysfunctional as he was, may have been frustrated about a few other things that he didn't have the language for. But the question I'm asking is, at what point do we see in Tyler Perry's work an acknowledgement of the things he experienced that black men are talking about and have only recently begun to do so on any kind of public stage, usually a public stage that we put together with our own hands? I'm on YouTube, but don't get it twisted. I'm building my platform on my own. Everything, the only support I get is from my listeners. There's no corporate funding for this. I'm not in a studio at a media corporation. You don't see any production assistants running around here bringing me coffee or editing video. No, most of the brothers you see on social media doing this work are doing it themselves. And many of us are self-taught. We've taught ourselves how to do animation, to edit video, to edit audio, to do all kinds of things. No assistance, no support, no programs with federal or city funding, or even funding from private investors to help us build these skills to pass on and grow and build with. No, every man in this space, for the most part, is like a cowboy. We all at the OK Corral, doing the shit ourselves and sometimes having battles in the middle of the street. But at the end of the day, we're each doing it for the most part alone. I managed to come into the space with the support of a few brothers that I really appreciate, that helped me out and cut my learning curves. You know, brothers like BGS, like Artisan MC, you know, GG, Green Gorilla, Dr. Ronald Neal, you know, a lot of brothers that came in this, or I shouldn't say a lot, really a network. But that's not the common experience for the average brother coming into the space. We're doing this on our own with very little support. Right? And that needs to be understood because we're railing against things that we have not had a platform to rail against. The injustices, the disrespect, the molestation, the abuse, the emotional abuse, all of these things, violations. We've not had a platform to say our side of that dynamic. And even for those of us who are in a position to do that work, sometimes the trauma dictates what we do to such a degree that we actually shoot other black men in our frustration. And I'm not talking literally shoot, but figuratively. And I suggest that Tyler Perry has been doing this for years, based on how we viewed things as children. See, this is the importance of resolution, working these things out, these traumas out, so you're not still responding to them at the age you were when they occurred. That's the thing about trauma, especially if you're talking about childhood trauma. Emotionally, you continue to respond to it with the maturity level you were at when it first took place until you are able to resolve it. And that's one of the things we have to deal with. I think even in the interviews, and this is no disrespect to Perry, because I've dealt with similar traumas. I'm not suggesting at all that this is lightweight work. It's not. But the reality is, much of the time, I heard the voice of the 5-year-old and the 10-year-old that still went through it. That means to me, this is not yet resolved for him. He's not in a healthy place about it, at least up to the time of these interviews. And when you look at his work and you see the narratives that he espouses, you can see he's still doing that work. Now, I understand that these spaces, are hostile. People will use any vulnerability to disrespect you, whatever. I share my story with brothers, not because I really give a fuck about who's going to say whatever about it, but because I'm trying to help the brother who may have gone through something similar and doesn't have the language or the means to articulate that. Sometimes we can even just share the courage to share our stories with each other, and that will fill you with something you haven't had before, so you can actually speak up loud about things that have taken place. I've outgrown my trauma, but I don't ignore it or sweep it under the rug. I share it because I'm trying to help someone else who's gone through it. That's the difference between dealing with resolved trauma and unresolved trauma. And when it's unresolved and you're in a position like Tyler Perry's, you actually can do more damage. And what's the damage I'm talking about in his context? Whether it's negatively portraying black males or only telling the stories from the vantage point of black women, which in and of itself invalidates the experiences of black boys and men. Particularly when you're at that level where you have global attention in your own movie studio. That's serious. And that is damage. Because there's so many black boys that need a 2022 Antoine Fisher movie coming from a Tyler Perry. It's needed. Boys need their stories told, even the stories they don't know how to tell themselves. And those boys become grown men that still need their stories told. So I hope the brother has reached some resolution since these interviews, but I also hope that either him or others in a position like his will actually take a different stance on dealing with black male trauma, other than further castigating other black men by turning us into monsters and reinforcing stereotypes about our monstrosity, and actually telling the real stories, even their own, about what also happens to men and boys. We can't be monsters all day long, especially when you've experienced the things you've experienced, Mr. Perry. Anyway, hope y'all got something out of it. I'm looking forward to hearing the comments. It is what it is. Y'all soon. Peace.